Today, I'm joined by Alicia Mini, who will be sharing her personal perspective on how organizations are navigating security culture in practice. You've worked at the intersection of security and human behavior. In your opinion, where do organizations still misunderstand what security culture actually means?
If there's one misconception I see almost everywhere, it's this. So most organizations call it security culture or security awareness when they actually really mean just security communications. So I will start with a scenario here. Imagine that, I don't know, someone receives an email, it is late in the afternoon. This email is from a familiar name. The wording is polite and the request is quite tiny, I would say. Just, can you quickly review this before I send it on? Of course, this email has an attachment and nothing looks obviously wrong. So it looks like there's no malware, no typos. And the choice isn't between is it secure and insecure. It's just between pause or proceed. So what I would really like to highlight is that security culture isn't what people know. It's what they do by default in moments like this. So if the organization teaches speed and helpfulness without reinforcing hesitation, culture will always favor the click. And attackers don't need ignorance. That's something very important to understand. Attackers only need habits that feel productive to be successful. Autopilot is the attacker's playground. So this is what we should really focus on. This is the thought we should give about thinking when thinking about security culture.
Security often looks very different depending on who you ask inside an organization. And where do those differences create the most tension in practice?
The tension people describe as dysfunction, it's often actually something else entirely. The tension isn't a dysfunction, it's actually a design. So I would say most organizations are usually built on silos, while security should cut across all of them. So I would say that security tension emerges where these silos meet delivery pressure. So imagine one team wants speed while another wants certainty and another one wants legal safety, for example. And security arrives spanning all three. So under pressure, this creates a gap that attackers love. So for example, imagine payment requests. So a payment request change, a request moves very fast. So one team assumes another has verified the request. Another assumes the approval has already happened. And everyone is acting reasonably within their roles. However, no one owns the gap between them. So the attacker only needs one assumption to hold. So a social engineer only needs that gap once. And I would say these aren't failures of individuals. They're failures of shared ownership in a system that is mainly siloed. So I would say silos don't stop attackers, they guide them. So that's exactly how this tension becomes an entry point for attackers.
And there's a lot of talk about investing in awareness, and organizations want to make sure that their workforce is well informed. But why do those efforts often fail to translate into day-to-day behavior?
I would say this is exactly where most awareness programs quietly break down. So awareness programs often train people to spot obvious scams, but actually modern social engineering blends into routine. Attacks usually, I would say, succeed because they feel very much ordinary. So we need to understand that behavior changes only when organizations design for these moments in between the ones we talked about earlier, and not just for quizzes and slides, which usually is what most awareness programs are led by. So if you think about it, awareness is usually taught in very calm environments. I don't know if you can imagine the last awareness training you did. You were most likely in a classroom, or sometimes it's online. So I would say at your desk. So this is a very calm environment. This is where you're relaxed and you have a moment, to focus on something different than your usual tasks. However, attacks usually happen in chaotic environment. So traditional awareness assumes people to calmly evaluate risks, but real attacks hit when people are usually multitasking. Think of, for example, of a QR code on a poster in the office entrance saying, update travel policy, scan here. Or a message saying, quick favor before my meeting. So in isolation, these two scenarios don't feel dangerous per se. They feel normal. And that's exactly why social engineering works. It works because it manages to blend into real work. And behavior changes only when organizations design for those moments and not for classrooms.
And my next question is actually a little bit mean because it's why do people who understand security risks still make decisions that expose the organization? And I'm guessing that is not an intentional thing.
Well, I would hope it's not intentional.
Yeah.
So I would say that it's very simple, actually. It's just because understanding risk and acting on this understanding are on two different levels. They are two different things. So if you think about most corporate cultures, and we're going back to the first question in this moment, because most corporate cultures reward deliver, 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 and speed. And in these cultures, hesitation, again, looks like failure. So in fast-moving cultures, people, it's not like they ignore security. They just trade it for speed. So a classic example here is urgency impersonation. You receive a request, for example, I need this approved now or the deal is blocked. Or I'm commuting. Can you handle this task quickly? So in a culture obsessed with responsiveness, pausing feels risky. So that's again where attackers thrive. Because in these environments where you can put together urgency and authority, caution collapses. Because the faster the organization, the cheaper the attack. It becomes much easier for the attacker in these cultures. So speed is the attacker's best ally, I would say.
There's often a focus on maturity models and compliance frameworks. How do organizations tend to misread their actual level of risk in practice? Have you seen some disparity between what they believe their risk level to be and then the actual reality of the situation?
So I would say that one of the biggest gaps I saw so far is actually between documented readiness and real-world response. So I would say that across many organizations, compliance tends to create a false sense of readiness. I mean, policies exist, controls are mapped, but when an incident actually happens, people tend to freeze or to panic. So imagine an executive impersonation, and these are really common. So an executive impersonation email triggers a payment change request. So the employee wants to do the right thing, but they ask themselves, who do I call first? where's the checklist? What am I doing wrong? So if those answers aren't immediately clear, and believe me, most often they are not, delays creep in. And again, it's an attacker's win. So I would say that we tend to confuse maturity with documentation. But maturity comes in when there's clarity in stressful situation. So compliance usually tends to create confidence on paper because we say, oh, we covered everything, we formalize it all. But incidents are the moments that expose reality and whether people know exactly where to go and what to do. And they need to know that they will be supported for acting early. So I would say that here's the misread that happens in most companies. And companies need to understand that compliance is not readiness. Every process must be tested. Every process must be part of a training. So we need to train for incident response, because if we don't train, it's going to be all on paper. And when the company is going to be hit, because we have to assume eventually it's going to be hit, the process would be a slowdown. Doesn't matter if it's formalized. If you don't test it, it's like it doesn't exist.
Say an organization has identified that there's room for improvements and they need to improve behavior. What approaches actually lead to this lasting change? And also, what tends to have limited impact?
I would say the truth here is quite uncomfortable. So what works is often not what feels impressive. So I would say that lasting change is quite unexciting because it happens in small behaviors and repeated consistency. So what works is reinforcing the right reactions, the small ones. So when, for example, someone reports a suspicious email, even if it turns out to be harmless, that response should be reinforced. Because over time, people learn that pausing and reporting is expected and not embarrassing. So what doesn't work is shaming people who fall for well-crafted attacks. Because social engineers don't reuse old tricks. They just refine them. But it takes experience and it takes reinforcement to learn how to respond to them properly. So I would say that lasting change comes from reinforcing behavior and not punishing imperfections. So let's say simply, make it easy, make it normal. Just reinforce it.
We've talked about organizations, how they're kind of they should be improving their security culture. But I also want to ask you about maybe seeing things from the attacker's perspective. From what you've seen, how well do organizations think from their perspective when designing their security approaches?
Attackers study workflows rather than infrastructures. So they thrive on moments of uncertainty, of transition, of urgency, assumption. So thinking offensively and integrating this thought, this way of thinking, means asking where your organization relies on people never being rushed, never being unsure, or never being overly helpful. So usually attackers look for end of quarter chaos or new joiners or assistants managing inboxes for senior leaders or eagerness in general. So they just have to send a fake calendar invite or a well-timed invoice change or a casual, can you resend a file? This usually is enough. So thinking offensively, I would say, means asking, where does our process rely on people never being rushed? That's as simple as that. because that's where attackers walk in. So again, let's go back to the topic of the autopilot. Autopilot is never neutral. And attackers don't need to break system. They just exploit assumptions. It's as easy as that. That's why it's super effective.
If organizations want security to become a shared responsibility rather than a compliance exercise, what needs to change at a leadership or organizational level?
I would say that shared responsibility doesn't emerge from intention, but it emerges from experience. So you don't get shared responsibility just by declaring it. Declaring is not enough. You have to design for it. So shared responsibility emerges when people are actually supported for slowing things down safely. And I know I'm repeating myself, but it's very important, this concept of slowing in security, slowing things down, stopping and thinking. Because let's put in a scenario here. Let's imagine an employee challenges a request claiming to come from a senior leadership. So in this scenario, instead of irritation, they should get support. Not and not just through policy, but through experience. Because if someone questions a request that claims to come from a senior leader and is backed for doing so, others learn that security is part of performance. If leadership routinely bypasses processes, saying, oh, just this once, just for this one time, well, attackers will use it because they know whose identity to copy. They know who inspires authority in the company because, come on, we're all on LinkedIn. And I would say that culture, in this case, scales through behavior that leadership allows, but also that leadership shows. So I would say that shared responsibility tends to grow where people see questioning and reported rewarded in practice, not just on paper.
Thank you so much for joining me on this interview.